A DC drive is the functional circuitry that can be employed to precisely control a DC motor. The drive operation allows the application of varying DC input levels so that the motor runs efficiently at different speeds. A DC drive circuit is composed of three main components: an operator controller, a drive controller, and a DC motor. One of the functions an operator controller provides is a method for altering the speed of the motor. The drive controller will regulate the input by means of either a phase control device or a pulse width modulator. And the DC motor can be an electrical device that needs to be adjusted to perform at various speeds. Let's look at the phase control method in a bit more detail. Phase control works by modulating a gated diode-like device, such as a silicon-controlled rectifier or SCR, into and out of conduction at a predetermined phase of a rectified AC half wave. This diagram depicts an AC sinusoidal wave being altered by a full-wave rectifier to produce partial half waves. The partial half-wave output produced is reduced based on when the firing device is activated. Adjusting the speed at the operator controller will determine when the SCR is activated and at what point in the half-wave cycle the wave is turned on or allowed to pass through. The area of the waveform will determine the amount of voltage delivered to the motor. Pulse width modulation, or PWM, is a method that uses digital signals to control power applications. In this example, a PWM uses a full-wave rectifier to convert an AC input voltage into a DC output level of 300 volts. A control circuit operating a DC switch turns the DC output on and off. This controller device can be an SCR or a powerful transistor. The on and off cycling of the controller circuit produces a repeating 300-volt square wave with a fixed frequency and width, as illustrated by this typical output displayed on an oscilloscope. One of the parameters of a square wave is the duty cycle. This is derived by dividing the time on duration or width, t sub 0, by the duration of the wave period, t. Thus, if the period is 2 milliseconds and the time on duration is 1 millisecond, then the duty cycle is 0.5. The voltage reduction will be 0.5 times 100% or 50%. Multiplying the duty cycle times the input voltage will give you the voltage output. In this example, a 300-volt input will be modulated by 50%, so the final voltage delivered to the load or motor is 150 volts. Thus, controlling the speed of a motor can be achieved by modulating the square signal waveform.
Thank you, great speech. So I'm really honored to be seated here with them. So it's my special day. Okay, this is but just a discussion, just a free talking about any issues. So, if you ask some question to them, so feel free to. Maybe I think the device, the program is not working, so I think you might have a difficult to send a message to it. So we can get the traditional way. Hands up, and you can ask a question to them. Okay, before them, so I want to ask a question. So I got the one question from my volunteer to the UI Benkler, Professor Benkler. He read your books. So he felt that when he read that Wealth of Network, he had many difficult to understand the sentence, the words, very difficult. But your new book, The Penguin and Leviathan, it was so easy to read that. So he was curious about that. Is there any change in your mindset or any change your strategy to provide your idea to the people?
I was just trying to copy Larry in his enormous ability to reach out and explain to people. There are trade-offs. There are trade-offs between what you can do with more academically oriented work, which actually had much more purchase than I expected it would beyond a narrow academic audience, and doing something that's actually intended to communicate more broadly. I think at the time of Wealth of Networks, it was important, at least in my mind, to try to anchor the ideas and change and facts in relatively detailed, let's call it academically legitimate form that would be persuasive within academia, even if at the expense of a broader comprehension. I think I wasn't adding to the science of cooperation that I was describing in Penguin and Leviathan. I was simply marveling at the fact that you had across so many disciplines a range of work that was coalescing. They didn't cite each other. They didn't necessarily know about each other. But I thought that it was important for people to understand in some sense that which normal people understand, that we are complicated. Yes, sometimes we want money, sometimes we want social. That which we understand about ourselves is not something that being expert and educated should lead you to abandon. In fact, it's something that should. So different books, different purposes, not sure what the next one will be.
Great. And already you mentioned the ceremony, the weird ceremony 10 years ago. I said that you are talking about the freedom, but the atmosphere is not free. So, but the one thing that you didn't know, so at the time, some professor that came to the event and for providing some congratulational address, but he just heard that this event is about copyright. So he said, we need to protect the copyright and we need to defeat the piracy. So I said to the translator, don't translate to him. Anyway, I remember that. So I asked you a question to the Boston 2 years ago. So I asked you, why do you challenge this difficult mission, the changing Congress at the time? So I said that, you think that is it possible? Do you say that, no, it's not possible. Why did that? You said, someone is need to do. So there's a conversation between us. I mentioned our vision or our mission is a very long journey and lonely travel to the goal. So as of now, what can you expect the result? So can you expect your mission is successful or get some output?
You know, I started as a very pessimistic person, and I've become more and more optimistic. And about this issue in particular, I'm incredibly optimistic. I think, you know, in the United States right now, there's an incredible recognition of the problem that Aaron started me on. It's Democratic and Republican. I don't know if you've been following this crazy man, Donald Trump, running for president in the United States. We in the United States are experts on Donald Trump because for 8 weeks, the only thing on television was Donald Trump. It was every single news show, every single hour of every single day, it was Donald Trump. And he would give a speech and there would be an hour-long coverage of Donald Trump giving a speech. More coverage of Donald Trump than the president of the United States. It's just the insanity of American media. But anyway, Donald Trump, in the second debate said, I basically own all you people, talking about the other presidential candidates. He's saying, I'm giving all of you money. One guy said, no, you didn't give me money. If you want to, that's okay, but you didn't give me money. But saying in the Republican primary that these people are not independent of the donors who give them money, and they can't be trusted to make decisions that are in the good interest of the public, but instead, and to have that spoken in the Republican primary was like somebody questioning communism in the Politburo in 1970, right? It's just like unheard of. You wouldn't say something like that, but that's what they said, and it dramatically changed the opportunity for that part of the American political spectrum to begin to acknowledge and think about that. That's a moment of incredible hopefulness because, whether in this cycle or whether in this race or whatever, it's inevitable that we're coming to see just how deeply corrupted and failing in the sense the government is, and I can't be anything but optimistic that recognition leads to something in response. So when I spoke to you, it might have been a bad day, but no, as hard as it is to get people on the inside to acknowledge it, or people on the inside to think about how it's going to be fixed, I actually am very, very optimistic that we're going to find a way to do this.
It's great. Okay, thank you. And Ryan, how many years are you staying in this community? 2 years? This as a CEO?
CEO since June of 14, so a little over a year.
So what is your experience, or what is your idea about the community?
So yesterday was a lot of fun for me. We had a number of people in this room who were in a kind of day zero conference as the affiliate network, which is, when Larry talked about internationalizing Creative Commons, this idea of local communities coming together around an idea and building something greater than just the licenses. And I think that's the thing that I didn't expect as much coming into CC, was how much power lived in the network. And so what I'm really excited about is, I think, I hear a story about how legislative change can unlock things that are broken at the systemic level. What I also want to think about is, what can a room full of people who share these values and every single day have opportunities, what can we do together to build that bottom-up piece that builds the environment that allows that to happen? Because I think publics give governments permission to act, and a noisy public and an engaged public creates the room for people like Larry to say the things that need to be said to audiences that need to hear them. So I think that's what I want to see for the next 3 days, is that conversation about what we can do to support these people who are articulating the challenges and actively trying to change things from the top. What can we do from every community in the world?
Okay, so my mission to provide you a time for thinking about your question is completed. Okay. Open the floor. Yeah.
저 마이크 저기 손 마이크 여기 가져가 이걸 가져.
Oh, hi. If you don't mind sharing my personal experience, so I actually worked on my PhD dissertation about Creative Commons license in 2005. So I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Lessig in 2006 in San Francisco, and then I came back to my motherland, Korea, 2 years ago. So it's great pleasure to meet all of you in this conference, and welcome. And I just want to ask you, as CC license have been adopted in different countries around the world, and as you are seeing and meeting this global community of CC people, have you noticed any differences among those countries? Because each country has different legal background and then different culture. So I bet you have seen some similarities, but I also wonder whether you have seen any notable differences among countries that have been adopting CC license?
So I guess my own experience is what CC did was give people a way to name a very human experience that they were having long before CC was there. This is a point that I think Yochai was making before, that we all had this experience of this different way of connecting and sharing, and now we have a structure to identify it, and once we have a name for it, we can then see it across a much wider range of contexts. And so when I've met CC people everywhere, in a certain sense, they're the same in that they want to practice this experience of sharing. Sometimes they're dealing with particular problems. So CC UK was born around the problem of how to take the BBC archive and make it more accessible. It's a very particular problem. It's very different from the way CC Korea was born. So those differences exist, but I think the more common fact is we've just found a way to make visible an experience and a practice that's always been there, but now because it's visible, we might actually encourage it and support it in a more overt way.
I would just add to that one of the things I've noticed and noticed very early on is that there is not one CC, there are many. People do not only identify as CC, they actually cross between multiple groups, and they're in this room. When I went to Open Knowledge Festival, there were people from Open Knowledge and Wikimedia and CC and EFF and all of these communities, all the various open communities, and it was true at Open Knowledge Festival and at Wikimania and at MozFest and all of these places where a number of all these people who share a bunch of the same values have found different ways to express them, whether it's in open source or in Creative Commons or in Wikipedia and all those places. And so, when I think about the commons, I don't think that that's just us. That's actually a much bigger thing that incorporates all those things. And so what's fun here is seeing all that cross-pollination and seeing a number of those same people in different contexts working on different parts of the problem around the world.
Mike.
Hi, Cable Green from Creative Commons. I work on education and our work in open policy to help people with money require open licenses on works that are funded specifically from the public. Yochai, this is a question for you. You talk about how we can rethink economic models and relationships in using a commons framework, and how Creative Commons is central to that. More often than not, when our community is engaged with open access or open educational resources or open science or whatever the open topic might be, we argue when we find ourselves in discussions on playing fields in the popular press where we have to argue from usually a fringe perspective. We're out, on your chart from the XY axis, we're out on the fringes and we have to argue why this is a better way. How do we switch those arguments around, as you so eloquently stated in your talk, so that we aren't viewed as the fringe in some of these conversations, but rather as a more rational economic solution to what's currently exists? Too often we're asked and challenged, and the burden is put on us about why the change should occur. What's your advice on how we turn that conversation around to put the burden on existing systems which are no longer working for society?
So there's a background. Famous American muckraker Upton Sinclair said it's hard to explain an idea to a man whose job depends on his not understanding it. And that's part, I think, of what you're encountering. That is to say, there's a hangover of 40 years of dominant economic thinking of a certain kind that makes it easy, without thought, to reject evidence of something else. And when you're in negotiations with somebody whose business model it is not to do what you're doing, it's hard. I think actually in the context of certainly scientific publication, the economic story is fairly straightforward. If you look at what the source of the science is, what the remuneration of the scientists is, you have to make some very, very quirky argument about the added value of the editorial staff and the high quality typesetting, and even that's only at the top science journals, to make a claim that you could plausibly even need that incentive. And then when you turn around and look at the cost of the libraries and the fact that libraries are cutting down subscriptions, that's actually relatively easy. You just need the numbers. I'd say with open courseware, it's a little harder, but still not impossible, and it depends on shifting the frame to understand the size of the educational industry and the number of people working, the amount of money, and the relatively tiny portion that goes into publishing by comparison to the entire system with tens of millions of students, etc., is just tiny. So there are the discrete answers, which is to say, in this particular industry, you map out the economic model and you show that it's really very small. In that particular industry, you show, for example, depending on what the level of education is and what country you are, how much you have public funding, how much you have educational investment by markets. There's a market, so that's in those particular two. The more general claim is, and this may be a little bit of an answer, I guess, also to Jay. There is hard work in building the actual detailed arguments for every given industry that successfully break down the incredibly powerful move to abstract away. Right? We've got the copyright industries. We've got the IP industries. That creates such a high level of abstraction of what the actual economics are that you ignore the fact that pop music is different from jazz, is different from classical in terms of where the sources of revenue are, how they play out, that any of these are different from trade books and different from fiction, and bringing things to more concrete, evidence-based policy in each of these, and leveraging the force that we have of saying, fine, I get your model. What's the evidence? What's the actual industrial structure? How does it play? Bringing it down back to the concrete, why in your industry it works as opposed to why it won't work, is the big move that I think we all need to learn how to do. And that takes work, but I think it's in that context of, instead of saying different theories across from each other, the evidence pulls back away from the abstracted theory. The market, the free market in its abstract sense, is a utopian vision. It's not a practical system anyone lives in. You just need to bring that down to the details of the systems themselves.
Okay, maybe we are behind the schedule, so we don't have enough time. So we can receive just 2 questions more. Okay, please.
Thank you. I'm Hal Plotkin, presently with CCUSA. Larry, it's so great to see you here. Thank you for making the trip. The response you just gave and Cable's wonderful question focused on our opponents and how we overcome their arguments. But in my experience, our opponents are a tiny minority of the population, the people who actively contest us, typically out of very narrow self-interest. And our larger problem are the cynics and the apathetic and the people who have just been conditioned to learned helplessness about the circumstances that we all confront. And I wonder what thoughts all 3 of you have about how we break through that and how we engage and re-engage the imagination of the broad, discouraged public around the world that knows that the systems they live under are not working for them, but that are not convinced that there's anything that they can do about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Long before I got into this race, we did a poll in the United States. We found 96% of Americans basically thought the money in the system was corrupt and had to be taken out. But 91% didn't think it was possible. So those two numbers together is the politics of resignation. So if you'd gone to Egypt under Mubarak and you'd said to the Egyptians, what do you think of Mubarak? They would not have been enthusiastic about Mubarak. And if you would have said, well, why aren't you out there in the streets? They would have said, what do you think, we're nuts? We're not in the streets because what are we going to do? And the same thing across history in many different contexts. If you don't believe it's possible, you're going to accept the reality and get on with your life. But what that points to, and the Arab Spring is a good example of this, is the incredible instability of that case. Because if you can begin to give people an image, a picture of how something different is possible, that thaws the resignation and unleashes enormous potential energy to actually begin to do things. And I think that's part of what the strategy of Yochai's work throughout his career has been to surface particular empirical examples that people can't sort of dismiss just as kind of an ideological claim made by some theorist about something. No, here is a real example of something really happening that's producing real results in the world, and you can't assume it's not there. You have to see it. And if you have enough of those, I think you begin to make it hard for people to live in that place. Or at least that's the hope. I think that's the only example of success that we've seen about that.
I was invited to speak at the Copyright Society of the USA, the highest paid rights holding, defending lawyers working for the largest industries. And it was a weird panel, and we knew we were weird, and so we were talking about open source and copyright, or Creative Commons, and they were looking at me. I had to explain Creative Commons to them because they didn't know what it was. And they were looking at me like I was crazy. And I showed them the slide that says that there are 882 million licensed works in the world at our last count, and we expect to pass 1 billion in 2015. And some of them couldn't possibly fathom. They said, one person said, why would you turn wine into water? And one of the lawyers on the panel beside me looked over at three of us who came from different parts of the open community and said, you people, pointing at the audience, you people are the weird ones. These guys, they're the future. Regular folks are not the kinds of people who exploit their copyright. Regular folks care about the stuff that these people care about. And so that's just to say, we are actually in the main, even though they have the power right now. And that's a really interesting place to be, so we need to figure out how to wield that power and how to engage those people so that they care about the benefits of open and that we're the answer to that. It's not about teaching them about licensing, it's about telling them the world they could have and then disrupting those markets and about changing that. And so I think that's what we're all here for, to talk about the next few days.
And I'd only add one more thing. I mean, more than one, because I can never do less than that. One is, Larry's books showed the way, right? Translating in ways that are really powerful. I think practice, just people doing. One of the things I found most exciting was the Pew survey and the proportion of people who actually share stuff online. Make something and share it. Beyond the total numbers, the sheer share of people who actually have experienced with themselves, hey, this is really cool. And the last piece is the politics. And SOPA PEPA on one hand and ACTA on the other in the US and Europe were a major transitional moment. We've now seen repeated efforts, and now the victory in net neutrality in the US again. One way in which you actually feel like you can do something is winning. And so continuing to win and getting 2-3 million people to call Congress, that's a way of getting people to overcome. That's the version of seeing it work. And the big failure, this is just one thing. If people remember, Occupy felt like it was a failure. If you actually plug income inequality into Google Trends, what you'll see is that the occupation of Zuccotti Park is the date on which the level of searches for the term income inequality in the US just completely changed in terms of its popularity relative to the 6 or 7 years before that of data available. You change people's minds and you show people you can succeed, and then it feeds back. That's the hopeful version.
Okay. No question? So, yeah, I think we had a better wrap up this discussion. Thank you for the great speech and great discussion. And again, it's my honor to talk with you. Thank you. Thank you, people. Enjoy lunch.
And in 1,000 years, when all our bones have disappeared, and every word has been erased, still the rivers flow, the sun will glow.
I just put Michael on there, okay? But it also has your name, just so we know that he belongs to you. Okay? I have 2 kids. You don't have. Pictures incredible.
Yes. You played this game before?
Are you ready for blast off?
All right, let's get ready for our countdown. 3, 2, 1. All right, let's get ready for our blast off. You're gonna feel the rocket ship start to move. You feel it? Can you smell the rocket fuel? Take a deep breath, man. You did awesome.